Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. To start with, I'm a bit shattered today, so please forgive me if I forget what I'm saying halfway through or gaze off into space, but I'll probably hopefully I'll keep it together. I should also say that it's not only my book, it's Leila al-Shami's book as well. Leila al-Shami is the pseudonym of another British Syrian who worked in Syria in the human rights field before the revolution. She worked with somebody called Razan Zaytouni, who our book is dedicated to. Razan was a human rights lawyer before the revolution. It was obviously very, very difficult to be a human rights lawyer in Syria. She defended political prisoners, and also the kind of person that she was when these political prisoners were released, often after decades inside, fairly broken people in many cases. She would accompany them. She would go around and see them and make friends with them and check that they were all right and they were adapting and so on. And of course, she's a secular. She was or is, we don't know. She's a secular woman, unveiled woman who doesn't like Islamism at all, etc. But of course, it made no difference to her if the political prisoners that came out were from the Muslim Brotherhood, or if they were communists, or if they were liberals. She cared about them as human beings and about their rights. When the revolution broke out, Razan was instrumental in, she was one of the core that first set up the local coordination committees. These were grassroots revolutionary organisations, just units of 5 to 7 people in each neighbourhood who would then coordinate with the committee in the next neighbourhood. There were other organisations, other local committees, organisations too, but the local coordination committees is the one that maybe became the best known. She also set up the Violations Documentation Centre, which was documenting the repression, the dead and the injured and the destruction and so on, and trying to get it out to the media. She, at one point, when after the revolution militarised, she was providing human rights training for militias in the East Ghouta. So she was doing all kinds of stuff, and then she was abducted. She and 3 others, the Duma 4 as they're known, were abducted almost certainly by Jaish al-Islam, which is the dominant militia in Duma in the East Ghouta outside Damascus, where she was living, and that was in 2013, and we haven't heard anything of her or the other 3 since. You see, I'll probably go on for 3 hours because I didn't even intend to say that. Once my mouth opens, I'm afraid I have to be shot sometimes to make it stop working. Okay, so thank you from Leila as well as from me. And Syria, when we look at Syria on the news, or we hear about Syria in the newspapers, or we hear people talking about Syria, in the West, it comes down to 2 issues in general. It's the terrifying prospect of off-white people crossing the Mediterranean and coming to live here. And this is obviously a huge issue because I don't know how many, was it like 1 million or something that tried to cross the Mediterranean last year or come to Europe last year. I would imagine that this year it's going to be a lot more than that, and this is going to continue for several years. It's likely that the Schengen zone in Europe will collapse this year and borders will go up as a result. This is having immediate and dramatic. Of course, as Putin is bombing, carpet bombing Syria and creating hundreds of thousands of new refugees, he's simultaneously funding extreme right-wing anti-immigrant parties throughout Europe. So the refugee issue is a huge issue. We should be paying attention to it. And then there's also ISIS, the Daesh phenomenon. ISIS, of course, understands the Western media very, very well. There's a kind of symbiotic relationship between the 2. Apparently, they've got a 100-strong media team, ISIS, which is made up mainly of Western Muslims who've gone to join them, people that have studied media here and know the culture here, and that's why you see that it's very sophisticated. A lot of their videos, their propaganda videos, are based on computer games, or based on Hollywood action kind of themes and so on. It's because they're deliberately plugging into a culture that's understood globally now. And also they know that if they put a white man especially in an orange Guantanamo jumpsuit and get an English-speaking child to cut his head off, and they make a high-production video of this, they know that that will be front-page news. Maybe the video itself won't be shown on every channel, but it will be the fact of the video will be front-page news everywhere in the world the next morning. So we hear, of course, Assad can incinerate 150 people a day by dropping bombs on them, and we don't get good pictures of it, and it doesn't look so exciting as a man with a beard in life. So we hear about the refugees, we hear about ISIS, we hear about diplomats and this big theatre of whatever their process is called, but we hear very, very, very little about the Syrian people. So there's a lot more happening in Syria than just jihadists cutting heads off and a fascist regime and various imperialist interventions. There's also some positive stuff happening. So I will read now. Many Syrians speak of their first protest as a moment of personal liberation. Julie, for instance, it's a pseudonym of course, people who spoke to us who have families still in regime-controlled territory used pseudonyms. Julie, for instance, the engineering student from Homs. At first I was scared to join in, but one day there was a very big demonstration which came from two directions, from the old part and the new part of Al-Wa'ad. When I heard the chanting, the people want, and the singing, I started crying. Suddenly I was filled with courage, and I picked myself up and walked out to join in. My mother tried to stop me, but I went anyway. It was a beautiful experience. I felt at last I was participating in the effort to lift the oppression off us. Before that, I used to be scared to talk even in front of my friends. I even cheered for Bashar at the university during his first speech to the People's Assembly. Can you imagine? It's something I regret very much now. And Yassin Kassab, a Christian from Damascus. There was such a positive atmosphere. It sounds incredible, but suddenly everyone had good ethics. People stood together. Their slogans were very beautiful. Remember, this is a people who've been brainwashed and kept apart for decades, the victims of a failed education system, a failed social system. In this context, what the people did was amazing. I went to Maidan to protest. It's a conservative Muslim neighbourhood, and I was wearing a skimpy top. One young man asked me, politely enough, to dress more appropriately when I came next. But his friend said, "No, sister, you wear whatever you like. We're here for our freedom after all." We really were ready to transform into an open society. We had great momentum. Syrians were discovering themselves and their country anew. They were learning the names of towns and villages they'd never previously heard of, places like Kafarenda, which produced such witty banners, slogans and cartoons each week, and seeing familiar places in fresh ways. Homs, though it is the ancient city of Emesa, used to be a nondescript city beside an oil refinery and the butt of 1,000 jokes. Now it was the capital of the revolution, a noble city to be praised and emulated. Competition and resentment between cities and regions was the old normality. Suddenly people in one place were chanting their solidarity with others. "O Homs," they sang, or Dera, or Benyas, or Dar az-Zor, "We're with you until death." And Arabs learnt the Kurdish word for freedom, Azadi. In endless spiral, protests met by gunfire led to funerals, which led to larger protests, which led to more funerals. Everybody on the streets now called for revolution, not reform. It's important to remember, interrupt myself, it's important to remember that in the first weeks of the uprising, people weren't calling for the fall of the regime, or for revolution, or for the execution of the president, and certainly not for an Islamic state. People started calling for that much, much later. In the first days and weeks of the revolution, it was the slogans were things like the Syrian people won't be humiliated, the Syrian people won't be insulted, and one, the Syrian people are one. So it was a call for reforms, it was a call for the regime to respect them and stop beating them up, and for a few more rights. It wasn't at that stage, it was the extreme violent response of the regime which then made people call for revolution. Everybody on the streets now called for revolution, not reform. Protesters were seen raising their right hands to swear to continue the struggle until the regime was toppled, no matter what befell them. By attending protests and speaking out, hundreds of thousands had burnt their bridges with a regime brooking no dissent. By principle and for reasons of survival, millions were committed to the system's destruction, by peaceful means if possible. What remained was to build an alternative. And now I'll read a little bit from the following chapter, which is about the alternative, what kinds of alternatives, structures, different people tried to set up in different parts of the country. Omar Aziz, fondly known to friends as Abu Kamil, was born in Damascus. An economist, anarchist, husband and father, he returned from exile in 2011 at the age of 63 and committed himself to the revolution. Working with locals to distribute humanitarian aid to suburbs under regime attack, he was inspired by the diverse actions he came across, the various forms of protest, as well as the solidarity and mutual aid within and between communities, including voluntary provision of emergency medical and legal support, turning homes into field hospitals, and food collection. He saw in such acts, quote, the spirit of the Syrian people's resistance to the brutality of the system, the systematic killing and destruction of community. Aziz believed that protests alone were insufficient to bring about a radical transformation, and that a new society had to be built from the bottom up to challenge authoritarian structures and transform value systems. He produced a paper in the revolution's 8th month, when the movement was still largely peaceful and before land was liberated, in which he advocated the establishment of local councils. These were envisaged as horizontally organised grassroots forums in which people could work together to achieve 3 primary goals: to manage their lives independently of the state, to collaborate collectively, and to initiate a social revolution locally, regionally and nationally. He proposed that councils network to foster solidarity and mutual aid and to share experience. Aziz helped establish the first local council in Zabadani, and then others in Berzeh, Diraya and Douma. Omar Aziz didn't live to witness the extent of the challenges that would beset Syria's revolutionaries, or the successes and failures of their experiments in self-organisation. He was arrested at his home on November the 20th, 2012. Shortly beforehand, he said, "We are no less than the Paris Commune workers. They resisted for 70 days, and we are still going on for a year and a half." He was detained with 85 others in a cell of 4 meters by 4. This contributed to the deterioration of his already weak health. He was later transferred to Adra prison, where he died in February 2013, a day before his 64th birthday. But his vision had a huge impact. Local councils, sometimes known as revolutionary councils, sprouted in 2012, especially and by necessity in the north as the regime withdrew. With the regime's retreat came the withdrawal of government services. Local councils ensured the provision of humanitarian aid and the fulfilment of basic needs, including water, electricity, education and waste disposal. They coordinated on security with armed resistance groups. The councils follow no single model, and each has a different size and capacity. Members are civil activists, family and tribal leaders, and people selected for their technical or professional skills. In general, they implement a form of representative democracy, and free local elections have been held in some areas, the first free elections in Syria in over 4 decades. Now, I would actually intensify that. Since we wrote the book, I would now say that free local elections have been held in most areas. There are definitely over 400 councils in Syria, the majority of them democratically elected. Leila, who I spoke to on Skype the other day, she's in the Middle East at the moment, has come up with a figure now of over 700, and I trust her and believe her, but I'm not going to officially repeat it because I haven't seen it myself. But I know that there's well over 400 definitely local councils, and some also provincial councils have been set up in Syria, and most of them are the majority of them are democratically elected. Now, I won't do it now, but when I've been giving talks about this. I've asked people to put their hands up, you know, if they've heard of the local councils in Syria. And it's been not surprising, but very sad that even in groups of... Okay, let's do it here. Who's heard of the local councils in Syria before? Lots of people there, ruined the thing, okay, good. So, no, but it's a little bit less than... That's the best it's ever been, but that's a little bit less than half in a room full of people who are engaged enough and interested enough to come to to spend their week, an evening of their weekend listening to me talk. About Syria. So you're engaged people and less than half of you. My point still stands, and often it's kind of 2-3% have heard of the local councils. Now that in itself, I think, shows us that before we get into discussing, you know, failures of the media and different interpretations of what's going on and so on, I think the fact that most people, certainly most people in the street, who've all heard of Assad, they've all heard of ISIS, they've all heard of these horrible refugees. I don't think anybody in the street has heard of the local councils in Syria. And this is such an enormous story. I mean, some people, I must say there's a slight exception, some leftists have heard about the councils in Rojava, in the Kurdish cantons. That's been much more talked about and appreciated. The councils in the Arab areas, which are not Arab councils because they contain all kinds of people, have not been talked about. They're equally democratic. You could even potentially make the argument that they're more democratic because there isn't an overriding political party in charge, but we can come back to that maybe. Both of them deserve solidarity. The Kurdish ones have been heard of and have received a little bit of solidarity from a few leftists. The Arab, well, the ones in Arab majority areas, just people don't know about them. In 2003, in the previous decade, Britain and America invaded Iraq. They marshaled, you know, billions of dollars and moved hundreds of thousands of men around. Supposedly, of course that's not what it's about, but supposedly in order to bring democracy to the Arabs. Didn't work out very well. And it was supposedly the Arabs having democracy was so important that it was like the key issue and the whole world had to move over it. And now we have Arabs and Kurds practicing democracy, and others, and Turkmen and so on, practicing democracy in the most difficult of circumstances, with bombs falling on their heads, with starvation sieges going on, and we don't really know about it. And I would suggest that just from the very beginning that shows a huge failure of journalism, and an ideological failure as well, because sometimes or very often, the information has been out there, but people have been ideologically blind to it because it hasn't fitted with their pre-existent story about what they think is going on. Why else is it important? Because this is part of the solution. You see all these ridiculous diplomats pretending that there's a peace process going on when it's obviously escalating. And they're all going around sort of having discussions about, can we talk to this group? Is this group a terrorist? Should we have should we talk to the coalition or not? Are they relevant or not? Look, nobody is talking about the councils. If you want to find representative Syrians who have been democratically elected, they exist. They exist. And then the second thing about them is that they are practicing local democracy, self-organised communities on a local level. Now, I think that's a good idea in all situations, in all societies, at all times. But it's particularly a necessary idea in a place like Syria at the moment, which, as a result of the war, and whoever's guilty for that, we'll talk about that maybe, okay, there's a, what am I talking about? You've put me off by saying 5 minutes left.
Local councils and why it's important in Syria.
And Syria is a country on the eastern Mediterranean and next to Iraq. Thank you.
Why it was especially important?
It's especially important, thank you, because for example, let's imagine a Syria, which we're very, very far away from, but let's imagine a Syria where nobody is dropping bombs and there isn't any total state, it's not Assad and it's not the Islamic State and it's not some other bunch of authoritarians who've taken control of the state. And what you have is these local councils. that could really work very well indeed, because you have a city like Tartus, for example, which is on the coast. It's a liberal city. It's probably has an Alawi majority, or it did before the war. It might not now. And if the local council there, I imagine, in the future, when they are able to have a local council, because Assad's gone in public, activism in Assad areas and ISIS areas is very underground, the local council there might decide that, probably would decide that the alcohol is freely available. Whereas in somewhere like Hama or Deir ez-Zor, which is much more conservative Sunni Muslim place, the local council might decide that alcohol is haram, it's not allowed in this area. And that way you could have these two communities coexisting. Do you see what I'm saying? It means that you could have a decentralization. It means that different people could, run themselves in a way that suits the social and ethnic composition of their area and the political ideas going on in that area. And if I've got 1 minute left, I'll just say that there's the main thing. In the book we have a whole chapter on culture. You can't, when a real revolution happens, it doesn't happen very often, we really should be noticing it, as well as all of this self-organised communities and democracy and so on. There's an explosion, a bottom-up explosion in culture. There's all kinds of arts coming out of this, from kind of comic slogan writing and graffiti through hip-hop and heavy metal and traditional songs which have been kind of turned into revolutionary songs, through poetry, internet poetry, all kinds of writing, all kinds of music, all kinds of art. There are women's centres, even in places where Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate, even in places where there's a strong Jabhat al-Nusra presence, there are still women's centres operating which have been set up by revolutionaries, and they're places where women can come together and there's some solidarity between them. They can campaign on issues, they can educate each other, they can find ways of making money. A lot of them now are widows or are the main breadwinner for their community. So all of these exciting things. There's over 60 free newspapers and magazines in Syria, in a country where a few years ago there wasn't one. Tens of free radio stations, free TV stations, etc., etc., etc. At this point, I'll shut up.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that great introduction. I want to we'll sort of get on to exploring more of the self-organisation in a bit. I actually wanted to pose to you a question about the sort of the militarisation of the revolt, because this is kind of what has been sort of in some of the ways one of the biggest barriers to this self-organisation that developed. Do you think the militarisation was inevitable given the way the regime treated the popular protests, or could it have been? Are there potential ways it could have been avoided?
No, I think it was inevitable. I mean, people sometimes say, the Syrians made a mistake when they militarised their revolution, or I can't support the Syrian revolution because it militarised. I would have supported them if they'd kept peaceful. It was a big error. And this kind of suggests the idea that all the Syrian revolutionaries and protesters all kind of had a big meeting one day and sat down and said, right, the motion today is, are we going to have a peaceful demonstration, or are we going to get guns and rocket-propelled grenades and kill people? And then they had a vote and decided to kill people. Of course, that's not how it happened. We opened the militarisation chapter here by quoting a long statement from the local coordination committees, in which they're basically saying, we understand the incredible pressures that people are under, but we are begging you not to militarise. Because what will happen people knew as they were picking up the guns. I mean, I've spoken to fighters who are very intelligent, educated people, and they knew as they were picking up the guns what would happen next. Before the militarisation, you had a horizontal mass movement. It really was a mass movement, and it was very diverse, and it was governed by no party or no single ideology. and it was making links across, it involved people of all sectarian and ethnic and class and regional backgrounds. And all of these people who very often wouldn't have even been talking to each other before, or wouldn't have been in the same neighbourhood together before, were making contact and talking about things and so on. So you went from this horizontal movement. When guns come into it, you need money. You need weapons. You need a source of ammunition. Otherwise, you're useless. You're just a sitting target. And so you need to form a militia. Local men got together, pooled their money, made a militia. You got local leaders in local areas. And then the thing begins to be transformed from a horizontal movement into a cacophony of authoritarianisms, different authoritarian people competing with each other, and so on. And yes, it was inevitable. It was inevitable. It was deliberately provoked by the regime. And people think, why on earth would the regime, why on earth would a government or a state provoke a war against it? Why would it kind of ask people to start shooting at it? That's insane, it makes no sense at all. Well, they've done it before, and it's been done before in other countries. It's a fairly tried and tested thing. In the late 1970s in Syria, there was it wasn't a mass protest movement like 2011, but there was a subversive movement against the regime starting in the late 70s, and it involved Islamists, leftists, communists, liberals, nationalists, Democrats. They repressed it with a fury. They repressed it terribly. Alawi communists in particular were ruthlessly eliminated. By 1982, all that was left of this movement after the traumatization and the repression was the armed wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which decided that their only chance was a gamble at an armed uprising in the city of Hama. And then, once they'd done that, the regime said, "Oh, okay, it's a war situation, you've militarized, so we have no choice but to defend the homeland." And they went in and they killed between 10 and 40,000, we don't know, because journalists couldn't get in and we didn't have mobile phones, etc., etc. at the time, and flattened the historical heart of the city, and that kept Syrians silent for the following decades until 2011. When I lived in Syria before the revolution, the whispers of the events, they were al-ahdath, the events, people wouldn't even name it. It was a terrifying thing. In Algeria, in Algeria in 1992, there were riots, so the military regime panicked and said, okay, you can have elections. And then in the first round of the elections, a democratic, we don't know because they didn't win, but they seemed to be a democratic, fairly moderate Islamist party, the FIS, won the first round of the elections. The regime then immediately cancelled the second round of the elections, arrested all of the members of this party, so put them in torture chambers in the desert, were very repressive in the communities which had voted in large numbers for this party. Within a year's time, an extreme Salafist terrorist group called the GIA, the Groupe Islamique Armée, the armed Islamic group, appeared and started slaughtering tens of thousands of people. It was completely infiltrated by the Algerian civil service. It turned into a civil war, which in the end the Algerian regime won, and by the end of that, most of the Algerian people were saying, God, okay, we'll stick with you. We prefer this to those mad people that will cut your head off if you smoke a cigarette. It worked there. If you look at what happened in Chechnya 1 and Chechnya 2, it's a very similar process, and of course, Russia is one of the main advisors of Assad. And how did they provoke it? Well, part of it was the rape campaign. I think that was a very strong one. They'd always raped in detention, men, women and children. But in 2011, 2012, the army was ordered to rape. So the army would start going into towns, villages, neighbourhoods which were rebellious, and they'd go into houses and they would rape the parents in front of the children, rape the children in front of the parents, and so on. Now, Syria is in general, it's a conservative religious society, where in many cases a woman's physical honour is considered to be as important or more important than life itself. So you can imagine the response, but I would imagine that even in London, if David Cameron sent militias into people's houses to rape their children in front of them, the case of Hamza al-Khatib, a 13-year-old child, who was, there were lots of cases like this. Hamza became famous, 13-year-old picked up off the street by the security during a demonstration. A few days later, his mutilated, tortured body was returned to his parents. His penis had been cut off, his body was covered with burns and gunshots and knife marks and so on. Why did they, usually when a fascist regime tortures somebody to death, they kind of put them in a box and bury them and say, oh, he hung himself in prison, nothing to do with us, he's buried now, you can't see the body. Why did they again and again and again return these mutilated, tortured children's bodies to the families? It's because they wanted the response. Why did they then release 1,500 mainly extremist Salafist jihadists who had been fighting in Iraq before? Then they put them in prison, and in 2011 they let them all out of prison at the same time that they were rounding up tens of thousands of peaceful, non-violent, democratic, non-sectarian activists for death by torture. A lot of these people who released went on and then formed Islamist militias. A lot of them joined Nusra and Daesh, ISIS. And of course it's a very effective thing, very effective, because now at this stage, who would have thought that years ago with those mass demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people, that this guy would still be there, but he's there. He's got the Americans as well as the Russians on this narrative like, ooh, the big threat is the mad jihadist that he's helped create, deliberately. Look at this terror. We need stability. We don't want all these mad people with beards running around with guns. We have to back him. We know he's responsible for 95% of the civilian casualties, and that he's bombed every city in the country except one, and that he's responsible for the vast majority of the 12 million people homeless, most of those inside Syria. We know all this, but we're going to have to work with him because there's a greater evil, which is Daesh cutting people's heads off. And of course, inside Syria, it's very effective, because the Alawi community, who I would say are the first victims of Assad in many ways, have been implicated in this thing. And a lot of them now feel there's a lot of Alawis who don't like the regime. They know it's criminal. They know it's destroying the country. They know it's making it impossible for their children to live with their neighbours' children. But at the same time, they understandably, in many cases, feel that they have no other option than to stick with it, because they see that if the alternative is going to be ISIS or Nusra coming and cutting our throats, then I have to stick with this guy, even if I hate him. So it's been a very, very effective process.
Just one more question before we open for the wider discussion. How did the self-organisation allow the revolution to sustain itself despite all this repression? In fact, we've still got communities living sometimes within 5 or 10 kilometres of Assad's palace, which have managed to sustain themselves through sieges, through daily bombardment.
One answer is I just don't know. It's incredible, it's inspiring. It's as well as all of the horrors of Syria, there's this miracle. You take the example of Diraya. Not all the councils are perfect, I must say. Some of the councils are not very democratic, and some of the councils, even if they've been elected, it's like anywhere else. They become dysfunctional because there are different factions or different families playing politics in there, and so on. But a lot of them are very good, and one of the very best is in Diraya, which is this suburb west of Damascus. It's an incredible place because it's been under siege for years, and bombs are dropping on it every single day, and there's constant attempts to come in and battles in at the entrances to the place and so on. There's starvation going on there. They're producing a newspaper there called Arneb Beledi, which means the grapes of our neighbourhood. A great newspaper which remarkably focuses on civic, unarmed resistance strategies, even though they're in that situation. Women are very much involved in that. Again, it's a conservative Muslim place, but you see how things have been shaken up. That it's women who are. There are also men involved, but the core of that newspaper is women. It's women who set it up, and they distribute it on the street because, of course, most people in Diraya don't have access to the internet. They've got. I read an article the other day about a library that they've built in Diriyah, an underground library. They've gone around getting books out of bombed and abandoned houses, and they've made a list of which building they took the book out, so that if in the future someone comes back, he can reclaim his book. And they've made an underground library, and fighters and civilians and activists and kids and so on are going down there and having discussions about books and reading things. In this situation, which I think is amazing. The only reason why life is continuing, the only reason why there are people still left in what are called the liberated areas at all, is because of the grassroots activism and the councils. And there we go. I mean, that's there wouldn't be anybody alive if it wasn't for these councils.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we'll open up to the floor now. Any questions or comments people want to make? Please just put your hand up.
Thanks. I'm interested, what would you recommend, what are the best sources for finding out about the local councils? So the local councils' Facebook pages themselves, or can you recommend, perhaps including yourself, authors who have written continuously about these councils? Because it's very difficult when you're talking to other people to counter, what's his name, from Robert Fisk or whatever.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to find credible sources that are consistent.
Yeah. I'm just looking in the bibliography to see if we did actually kind of put anything in there. There's a guy called Yassin Munif, and there's an academic in America called a Syrian called Yassin Munif. He's actually the son of a very great Arab novelist called Abdurrahman Munif, but that's by the by. And he's written. It's online. I mean, he's written kind of detailed studies, some of which we quote here, of specifically the council in Manbij, and he's really interesting work about how the council in Manbij, and then ISIS arrived, and then for a while there was a coexistence of these two systems, and then ISIS in the end managed to shut them down, and it did that by capturing the grain silos and being able to control bread distribution. So yeah, I mean, I'd look up. There aren't a great many sources. I mean, our book does talk about them a lot. There are other people. There's a lot of it in Facebook. There's Yassin Munif. I'm sure there must be better answers than that. Can anyone else help me? My mind's a bit blank. No, but if you are you friends with me on Facebook? Make friends with me on Facebook, and maybe if you do, and send me a note asking, I can when my brain is working, I'll make you a list or put you in touch with people. There's very little written on it, but I think there's more being studied about it now. And also the British and the American governments and others must know about them, because they don't talk about it, but they do actually in some cases work through them, because they find that if they're going to deliver aid into Syria, it's the only effective way of doing it. So they must have kind of contacts and so on, but they're not talking about it, and they're certainly not supporting them in the way that they need to be supported.
Can I ask a question? I'm really interested in the motives of the West and Saudi Arabia and so on. So essentially the West and Saudi Arabia have tried to seed pro-Western governments around the world. They back up dictatorships across the globe. They arm repressive governments across the world, and they try to undermine democracy wherever they can. Why have they been, therefore, after Assad? Why has the West and the United States and Saudi Arabia backing this war against Assad? Since they are so anti-democratic.
Okay, I think Saudi Arabia, if we have time, I'll come back to, because I think that's a different case. About the United States, I must say that I'm afraid I disagree with the assumption behind your question. I don't believe that the United States is trying to get rid of Assad. I think that if the United States had wanted to get rid of Assad, he would have gone in 2011. Here's one of the areas, one of these big grand narratives where people approach it from a big pre-existent story rather than looking at what's happening at the grassroots. I mean, I must say to start with that I am not somebody here who's trying to defend an American regime change program or Western imperialism, or to say that one kind of imperialism is better or worse than another. I oppose all forms of imperialism, and I agree with you absolutely that, in a lot of, I think it's too general what you're saying, because I don't think the world is just the American empire. I think it looked like that for a while until 2003, but from the fall of the Soviet Union to 2003, it looked like it was a unipolar world. But actually the Americans themselves know that they made a hell of a mistake in 2003. It was hubristic. They thought that they were so powerful that they could walk into Iraq and remake it in their own image and get them to make peace with Israel and everything else, and they'd make loads of money out of it, and the whole world would look up to them and be scared of them. And actually, of course, militarily they won, of course, but well, at least in the first, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, they achieved that, yes. Politically and economically as well, they lost, and they know that they've lost, So anyway, about Bashar al-Assad, you have to remember that this guy who poses as an anti-imperialist, and people think, oh, it's just 2003 all over again. In 2003 in Iraq, there wasn't a popular revolution. It's a lot more similar to 1991 in Iraq, where the Western and international coalition had just kicked Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. They destroyed the Iraqi army and most of the infrastructure in 1991, but they decided to keep him in power. George Bush at the time made a speech, George Bush Sr. made a speech in which he kind of appeared to be calling on the Iraqis to rise up against the tyrant. So if you listen to their rhetoric, you would have thought at the time, oh, they're going to get rid of Saddam now that they've destroyed his army. But what actually they did in 1991 was that they gave him permission, a written deal, they gave him permission to use his helicopter gunships to put down the uprising in the south and to create mass graves. And that's the period at which the sectarianism in Iraq really got bad, because Saddam used a lot of sectarianism in that against the Shia uprising in the south, as he painted it. So I don't think that the American thing is to keep strong men there. It's much easier to deal with one guy who you can threaten or bribe or pat on the head or whatever. You deal with one man. If you're dealing with democratic communities, it's much more difficult to get what you want. It's much more complicated. The idea that they've been arming the Free Army, I mean, I wish they had. They haven't. In 2000, well, let me be more specific. In 2000, at first, they absolutely said, no arming of the Free Army, this will escalate things, and also Islamists might get powerful if we arm the Free Army. Of course, the absolute opposite happened, because the Free Army, because the non-ideological defectors from the military, and local men who were just defending themselves and didn't want to impose anything on anybody except stop the regime killing us. Those people should have been supported. I think those people should have been supported. When the Turks and the Qataris and the Saudis began to support various groups in their own incoherent way, and each state choosing its own people, what the Americans could have done if they wanted to be useful then is they could have come in and said, look, Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, if you're going to do it, let's do it in a centralised way. It all has to go through the Free Army, no Islamic militias, and it has to go through one leadership. And then when that one leadership has guns and ammunition and money that it can give to its fighters, it will have authority, and then it can then impose discipline on them. It can then expel people and refuse to fund them if they commit crimes, and so on and so forth. But it didn't do that. What it did was it sent the CIA to the south to the Turkish border, and it vetted what was going in. So it allowed it allowed the Turks and the Saudis to send in Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenades, which didn't make any difference. It usually refused, for a long time, it refused any anti-tank weapons, and from then until now, not one anti-aircraft weapon has got in, which is what the civilian communities need to defend themselves from utter destruction and ethnic cleansing. It's been criminal what the Americans have been doing. They vetoed it. In 2013, when ISIS appeared, then they did start supplying some weapons to a few vetted Free Army groups, And it was always because they wanted them to be fighting, it was in the context of fighting ISIS, not Assad. In 2015, they had that ridiculous training program where they got 50 odd or 80 or whatever it was Syrians, and they trained them, and then they immediately all disappeared on day. There were tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Syrian men who wanted to be trained and given a gun so that they could defend themselves. But they were asked to sign a pledge which said that you are going to fight ISIS, not Assad. This is a fact. This is a fact. Now, the story that you're getting from the so-called leftist media as much as the rightist media, I can't see a difference between them myself. The story that you're getting from Fisk and Coburn and these people, and all kinds of people who I used to have some respect for, this regime change narrative, I'm sorry, it's not based on fact. Yeah, true, there have been some guns and so on. And then recently, after the sarin gas thing, you know, Obama said that chemical weapons is a red line. And at the time when he said that, Syrians were upset because it seemed to say that you can use cruise missiles and Scuds and whatever you like, but but it's just not chemical weapons. But he used chemical weapons. He killed 1,500. There are ridiculous conspiracy theories from Seymour Hersh that it wasn't him, but they are ridiculous and they've been discredited comprehensively. He used chemical weapons. He killed 1,500 people in 5 hours. And at that point, Obama did worse than nothing. He didn't just say, okay, there's no red line, I'm not going to do anything. He actually handed that file over to the Russians. It was in effect saying Russian imperialism is taking care of this. American imperialism takes care of the Egyptian regime and of Israel and so on. And Russian imperialism, now this is the new cooperative world. I don't think this is anything to celebrate. I don't think that we should be finding ourselves in a situation where we're saying there's a good imperialism and there's a bad imperialism. Or there are goody states and there are baddie states. Because states are not like human beings that we can love and hate. States are designed to protect the privileges and the property and the position of the elites which run those states. All states, every state. And any state which, as soon as it has an opportunity to extend itself, to extend its power and influence, begins to become imperialist. All of them. That's the nature of a state. And leftists used to understand this. Leftists used to understand this, you know? And it's the degeneration of leftism that so many of them, or the dominant left now, has just come down to like, oh, I'm going to side with Iran against Saudi Arabia, or I'm going to side with Russia against America. And it becomes Oedipal. It becomes, if I'm a Westerner, I live in America, therefore my daddy is the American government, so my image in my own head is that I'm against the American. All imperialism is filthy. All states are filthy. All of them. There you go. And I don't agree with you that there is a regime change agenda. The Saudis, in 1 second, because someone else wants to ask a question. The Saudis, yes, they have been doing much more. They haven't, it's a myth that they've been funding and arming ISIS. That's nonsense. They're terrified of ISIS. The one Islamist group that ISIS is their competition at home. The one Islamist group that the Saudis have been funding is Jaish al-Islam in Douma. And I have big problems with Jaish al-Islam, but I must say that despite, amongst them, the fact that it abducted Razan Zaytouni, who I talked about at the beginning, big problems with this group. But I must say that even where Jaish al-Islam is dominant, councils operate, women's centres operate, there is civic life. And Jaish al-Islam has been the most effective fighter of ISIS in southern Syria. They've been largely successful in keeping ISIS out of Damascus and the Damascus suburbs in southern Syria. Other than that, the Saudis have been funding the vetted free army groups that the Americans approve of. They're not funding Nusra or ISIS, they're terrified of them. The Qataris have been funding more extreme Islamist militias.
You and then
Yeah, hi. I mean, just following from that question, I mean, in that kind of context that you've outlined there, I mean, I'm just interested again to know that kind of bigger geopolitical strategy. It is very confusing, very complex situation, trying to unpick that narrative and timeline. But I mean, it seems obviously we know there is an extensive history going back over 30 years of collusion between various intelligence agencies and radical Islam, these kind of jihadist groups. And that's something we don't often hear about. And we're presented as, ISIS or whoever it might be, but it's obviously all has its origins in Afghanistan, doesn't it, going back to the Soviet War and so on, and the Cold War. But perhaps you can shed a bit of light on that. And I mean, in terms of the US, I know you've obviously outlined there that your position, but in terms of that US geopolitical strategy, we know there's that 2006 document from WikiLeaks from the US ambassador outlining plans to destabilize the Syrian state, the Defense Intelligence Agency documents that were leaked from 2012 about how the US system was very aware of the developments of ISIS and predicting that a caliphate would exist and so on. And so in terms of that, to me, it seems that geopolitical strategy actually is to weaken that Shia sphere running from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah.
Why if they... Do you know Chris Patten?
Yeah.
Chris Patten, who was a big Tory minister at one point, wasn't he? And he's been given a new position now. His job now is the leader of the British business delegation to Tehran. And he's very enthusiastic about going off there and opening up. It's all opening up now. The sanctions have ended on Iran. Obama's just done a big deal with Iran. This idea that they're weakening the Shia sphere. Are you aware that in Syria at the moment there are tens of thousands firstly there are thousands of Iranian troops. Assad would have fallen without Iranian intervention first, and then Russian intervention. He was losing battle after battle after battle, and then the Iranians sent Hezbollah in, they sent in militias from Iraq, and then eventually they sent in their own troops as well. There are tens of thousands of Iranians on Shia foreigners on the ground fighting the Syrian people. That actually is one of the key causes in both Iraq and Syria of the rise of ISIS and of Sunni identity politics. Iran is much more guilty, actually, in this case, than Saudi Arabia for ISIS. The reaction of Sunni Muslims when they're suddenly faced by, Sunni Arab Muslims, when they're faced by Shia Persians who speak a funny language and they're pointing guns at them and blaring and waving Shia flags and blaring Shia songs, there's obviously going to be a Sunni identitarian backlash to that. I've forgotten the rest of your question, I'm sorry.
In terms of, obviously, the collusion extensive...
Yes, the general thing is, I think that yes, perhaps in 2006 we can find some document that was written by an American or by a think tank or by a department in the government or whatever in which they have plans to destabilise Syria. Of course, this stuff is always going on and so on, and they want to get... I don't think they wanted what they've got at the moment. I really don't think they do. I don't think the Europeans, it's not in the Europeans' interest. The Europeans are burying their heads in the sand, as I said before, about how much this is going to hurt everybody. The idea as well, again, this is the problem, I think, when we start from... I'm not discrediting everything you're saying, because we have to have our eyes open to that kind of thing. But when you start from the outside and then go in, I don't think you understand it well enough. I think you have to start from the grassroots. Talk to the people on the ground. Why did I remember people saying it in 2011, people coming up with, it's one of these colour revolutions where the CIA is sent in a... No, I'm sorry. If I come and murder your child, is your first response going to be to get in touch with the CIA and should I be upset or not? Because that's what it's saying. That's what it's saying. A mass rape campaign, a mass torture campaign, a detention of tens of thousands of people in the first